And finally, we're going to be looking at paid labor through the family responsibility approach. So, the family responsibility approach is looking at this unpaid labor of the household that is essential to family functioning, right? Obtaining and growing and preparing food. Maybe not growing always, but outside of the United States, yeah. Laundry and cleaning and collecting fuel for family consumption, sanitation, childcare, healthcare for any family members, um, and then that daily routine stuff and caregiving for children and elders and sick family members, right? Um, there's a lot of unpaid labor that is available for everyone to take advantage of in the world. And typically we measure who does what and how much using a time use survey. Time use surveys are labor surveys. They provide gender segregated data about how people spend their time, both in paid work and in unpaid work. And you probably won't be surprised to hear that in not one single country do men spend as much time in unpaid labor as women. So while every individual household is different and has its own nuances and quirks, for the most part, we see the same three explanations show up as patterns when it comes to why we have gender-based division of unpaid care work. The first two are relatively simple and kind of make sense. In general, the problem here is that the patterns usually fall in a direction where women end up with more unpaid care work. The last one makes no sense and it needs to be thrown out altogether. That's my opinion. So, with the relative resources explanation, the partner who earns less will be expected to do more unpaid labor, right? And this means that we're putting emphasis on the partner who's providing the most for the livelihood and protecting their position. Now, we actually use this arrangement in my own household, and for us, we actually are kind of bucking the norm because I am the person who's earning more, and so the expectations of how my household runs means that there's a lot of energy going into supporting me and my work. Um, this works out in a more positive light because I am a woman. And typically, that this expectation would it be the reverse. And so depending on where we've lived overseas, typically this has been kind of like very, very like the amount of surprise at this depends on where we lived. But overall, both Japan and the United Arab Emirates, it was unusual. Okay. It was unusual to see not just women working and earning more than a man, but to see that the partner who's earning less actually was doing more and was a man. Okay. People were used to seeing, depending on where they came from, men who weren't working as much as their wives or making as much money. They were not used to seeing these men do work at home. So that was problematic. In the US, we see this a bit more, but we still have very much a patriarchal arrangement where the expectation is that men will make more money and that women will provide for the home. The time availability explanation is very similar to the relative resources explanation, and sometimes it goes hand in hand, where the partner who spends less time in paid labor will do more. And again, my household turns this one upside down a bit as well. And that is because I am a professor who is in tenure, right? Who is working their way through tenure. And so, first of all, if you don't know this, professors, although we seem to have lots of time off, we are never completely done or separated from our job. We don't leave at the end of the day and stop thinking, right? And there's no way that we can both teach, prepare courses, and grade all within an 8 to 5 schedule. You know that just by looking at how far behind I am on your grading. And so we often end up having to spend a lot more time working, and that includes me. I'm at work right now. It is a Saturday evening at 5:23 p.m. My husband is at home with our kids, probably feeding them at this moment, right? And this is not an uncommon occurrence. And so I'm spending more time doing paid labor activity. And so he would typically spend more time in doing work at home. However, we are not the norm. And typically, because women have less hours given to them, because remember, there are these expectations that they are supplementing a man's income, or that they don't need it as much, or that that they will, be unreliable because of their family roles, right? And so women are overrepresented in part-time work. And so typically women would end up being not just the partner that earns less, but also the partner that spends less time in paid labor, right? And then finally, there's gender ideology, right? That the division in labor just reflects beliefs about traditional gender roles. So yeah, women are just expected to do certain types of work at home. And no matter whether they may be, earning less or spending less time in paid labor, that there's still an expectation that they're going to do those jobs. Okay. For example, there are studies that show that as wives' hours of employment rose, their time spent on household labor and care decreases, right? But is it because the men are doing more? Mm-mm, mm-mm. Even in these cases, it's because either women are just lowering their standards, or because they're passing that work on to other women, because it's still women's work. They might be outsourcing it, or they're just not doing it, right? And that's where that second shift comes in sometimes as well, where more often than, the lowering of standards or the outsourcing, the second shift where you're working a shift in paid labor and then you come home and work a shift in unpaid labor, or you do it before. You get to pick, right? So yeah, it's annoying, right? Household labor or housework is viewed as a symbolic representation of gender relations, and it's not just about money or time. That women and men are playing roles based on their performance, right? Their gender performance in the home. And so there could just be this idea that women should be serving their man, right? And that it can be something that reinforces their masculinity, right? And it's really, really interesting to see, like, when we do studies, like literally there was a 20 country World Bank study that found that the definition of a good husband was making money for his family. And the definition of a good wife was one who carries out domestic responsibilities. So what are the consequences? Longer work days for women with less leisure time than men, right? You can look at the time use chart graph on the right to see some examples there. Unpaid responsibilities limit women's availability for employment. Also, looking for a job takes time. Getting a job takes time. And we've kind of talked about how our social structure is built on the idea that there's going to be somebody doing unpaid labor at home. Think about the time that schools let out, right? When do kids get out of school? What time? Often it's before the end of a normal workday, or it doesn't take into consideration what the hours are of a workday, because there's just this expectation that someone will make themselves available. And typically that someone is expected to be a woman. I think one of the most egregious things that has ever occurred is the fact that on Wednesdays, my kids get out around 1 p.m. Whereas I am like, why? Like, I don't completely understand why every Wednesday is an early day. And that might just be a personal problem. I don't know. You tell me. It also limits opportunities for education, and it limits women's political participation. You don't have time, you can't participate, right? So yeah, it's giving a lot of yuck. So in a special little additive thing here, I want to talk about one major factor involved in family life and work and gender, and that's maternity leave. So government policies on childcare and maternity leave can be viewed as a reflection of how a society sees the proper role of women in a society and whether or not their participation in the labor force is desired. So, what you're looking at right now is a graph that's showing the number of weeks of paid parental leave entitlement in select countries. And what do you see there? Overall, the highest number of weeks are in these amazing nations for egalitarianism, right? And that the lowest are a bit surprising, especially one, the United States. The United States is the only OECD wealthy, core, first world nation that does not offer any protected paid parental leave entitlement for anyone, men or women, no one. Now, do we have laws about leave altogether? Yes, but nothing about whether it should be paid parental leave. What does that mean? What do these policies tell you? Right? What does the policy of a country like Finland with 170 weeks, that's more than 1 year. That's more than 2 years, right? I think if my math is right, that might be more than 3 years. What does that tell you, right? Compared to Switzerland with 16 weeks, Mexico with 13 weeks, or God forbid, the United States of America with none. What does that say? Now, we haven't even gotten into the distribution of parental leave, right? Because typically the expectations, as you can see in like Switzerland, Israel, Mexico, are that parental leave is for women. If you are the one who makes the baby, you should be the one that stays home with the baby. And we're not going to get into the injustices of that, right? Unless you're in a female same-sex couple, which more power to you, you're going to get a lot of time off paid parental leave in those places. Both of you, perhaps. Right? But we haven't even gotten to that point yet, and we're already at a problem, right? So these protective measures are important. And we actually look at data surrounding whether or not nations provide maternity protection measures. These are policies and laws that ensure that people who are expecting, people who are nursing, will not face employment discrimination, will not be exposed to health hazards, will have time off to recover, will have the ability to breastfeed safely, and will be able to return to work, that their job will be there. That's a maternity protection measure. Another thing that we rank and compare countries by is maternity leave policies, right? That's what you're looking at here. The maternity protection measures providing time off for people following the birth of a child. Now, with maternity leave policies, right, that's just giving the time off. It doesn't mean paid time off, just the time off. So the US does have that. We do have maternity leave policies. We have family leave policies. Now, most countries, right, not even just talking about the wealthy nations now, globally, most countries, wealthy, poor, yes or no, they have a law guaranteeing women some amount of paid maternity leave. So we're not just outliers among our peers, we are outliers internationally. I believe the United States is one of only 3 or 4 nations total globally that does not have paid maternity leave. Typically, women in particular, or those who are birthing, are eligible for at least 2/3 of their pay during that period. So the International Labor Organization actually has some data on this. And that data focuses on how many countries follow what's called the Maternity Protection Convention. And this is like, these are the standards, the international standards for having good policies on maternity, paternity protections. Only 65 countries meet all 3 conditions of the Maternity Protection Convention. I'm sorry, it's just sad. But what's the most sad is that we are not one of the 65 countries that meets these conditions. All right. So at least 14 weeks of maternity leave. 53% of countries have that. We're not one of those. I think ours is 12 weeks. Women on maternity leave receive a cash benefit of no less than 2/3 of whatever her previous earnings were. 45% of nations, we are not one of them. That they should be paid through Social Security or social insurance to reduce the burden on employers and to reduce discrimination against mothers. I'm sorry, I am yelling a little bit. 60% of nations have that. We're not one of them. This is out of 187 member states of the International Labor Organization worldwide. Right? It's an international organization. We don't meet any of those 3 protection conventions. So frustrating, despite the fact, right? Despite the fact that we have the means to do so. Now here we're looking at where fathers get the most leave, paid parental leave, right? Where do we see some more progressiveness? Now, don't be fooled by Japan with its 30 weeks. Because the men aren't going to take it. That's number one. It's there as a good faith effort, but culturally, the idea of men being providers is so strong that even when the government provides it, most men will not be taking those 30 weeks. They might take a week, right? So it's good to have that amount so huge because at least it'll encourage you to take a little bit. And this is, again, this is deeper than even just looking at parental leave. It's a part of how work is embedded into the culture. I don't know if I've shared this before, but in Japan, there is literally the ability on your death certificate to have your death be attributed to death from overwork. And that is a noble and honorable thing to have on your death certificate. So yeah. Yeesh. But yeah, these are the nations that provide paid leave that can only be taken by men. And this is the amount. And again, these are selected nations. These aren't all of them. Okay. Now, one thing that I brought up in a previous video was the idea that there can be a double-edged sword when it comes to expectations about gender roles. And especially when it comes to either having those expectations or not having them, right? Countries that do have expectations about gender roles, one of the problems is that they may provide that maternity leave, but won't have any form of paternity leave, which is a missed opportunity to promote fathers' involvement in the lives of their children, right? That having these types of leaves, especially when they're provided through the employer, reinforces perceptions that women are costly and unreliable. That often the lack of childcare becomes a woman's responsibility and affects women's employment more than a father's employment. Point in case, no matter what we do, my kids' schools will always call me first. And the doctor's offices will always call me first to make appointments. We can call Trina first or call my husband first. I've often tried to not put my number on things. Somehow they still find me, right? Because I'm mom. And so especially if I wasn't in the position that was the breadwinning position, there would be an expectation that I would take the L, right? When I would leave work, that I would call in more often, right? And that's a problem. It's been really hard for our family actually to find a position that fits for the expectations of our household, where they will not blame my husband for having to leave work to go get his kids, right? So it's a problem. And in particular, it can become a problem because if there isn't affordable care, right? If our governments aren't involved because, we're going real hard into that equal opportunity, into the direction of not providing services for people who might be parents to be able to work, then those families may leave kids alone or take older kids out of school earlier. This is a global issue in particular, maybe not so much in the United States, or may leave them with someone who they might not trust that much, right? So yeah, there's this huge mommy track placement, right? Where women are set up with precarious expectations for their potential, their production, right? There is a motherhood penalty where they might be paid less because of those expectations. And there can even be, just like that glass escalator, a premium for fatherhood, where because there's this assumption that you're the breadwinner, that you might actually be put into a higher position or given more responsibility upon becoming a father, because there's a belief that you're going to need more. This does not happen for women, right? So yeah. All right, and just one more image here. This is showing 2018, 20 wealthy countries. How much leave, one more time, for women and men, or for mothers and fathers. This is very heteronormative. This is very binary based. I'm sorry. Most of the data on this stuff is. Notice again the US at 0. No. I can't keep mentioning that because it's just so obscene. And then you'll see all of these other nations that we consider to be either our equals or beneath us when it comes to wealth and power in particular, maybe not culture. And just look. There's a big difference between the US and Israel. 0 versus 16 is different. Those are two very different numbers. And while 16 is still sad, it's not as sad as 0. What does that say? What is that telling you? So this was our penultimate module. Next, we'll get started on our last chapter in our last module on politics. See you then.